guys, and welcome back to Reading Club. So today, I'm going to read you My Weird School, Mrs. Roopy as Loopy, Chapter 11, and the last chapter. Chapter 11, Just Admit It. It was no use. Even after we proved to Mrs. Roopy that she was dressing up as all these characters, she still wouldn't admit it. Mrs. Roopy is in denial, Andrea said when we got back to the classroom. I'll bet you don't know what that means, AJ. Sure I know what denial means, I said. It's that river in Africa. Not the Nile, dumbhead. Denial. It means she can't admit herself that she has a problem. So what are we supposed to do now? Michael asked. There's only one thing we can do, Andrea said. We've got to tell Mr. Klutz. Mr. Klutz is the principal, which means he is like the king of the school. One time I got into trouble and was sent to Mr. Klutz's office. When I got there, he didn't punish me. He gave me a candy bar. Mr. Klutz is nuts. We told Miss Daisy that we had to speak with Mr. Klutz and that it was a matter of life and death. She called the office, and in a few minutes, Mr. Klutz arrived. Mr. Klutz had no hair at all. We told him all about the crazy things Mrs. Roopy had been doing, and how Andrea's mother is a physicologist and she thinks Mrs. Roopy might have a big problem. We were really worried about her, Emily said. This sounds pretty serious, Mr. Klutz said. Maybe you'd better go and have a little chat with Mrs. Roopy. Mr. Klutz led us down the hall to the library. When we got there, Mrs. Roopy was lying on the floor under the treehouse. She was holding her head like it had been hit. Not only that, but Mrs. Roopy was really fat. It looked like she had gained about 1,100,000 pounds. What happened to Mrs. Roopy? Michael asked. Are you okay? Mrs. Roopy? Who is that? Mrs. Roopy said. My name is Humpty Dumpty. I was sitting on that wall up there and I had a great fall. Don't tell me, Andrea said. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put you back together again, right? How did you know? Mrs. Roopy asked. You're not Humpty Dumpty, Andrea said. You're Mrs. Roopy, our librarian. Just admit it. It doesn't matter who it is, Mr. Klutz said. There has been an injury. I need you to write a report and give it to the Board of Education. You can give it to me, I told Mr. Klutz. I'm bored of education. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. Mr. Klutz said he had to go call a doctor for Humpty Dumpty. Mrs. Roopy got up off the floor and dusted herself off. Wait a minute, I said. I have a question. Yes, AJ? Asked Mrs. Roopy. Your name's Humpty Dumpty, right? Right. What I want to know is, why did your parents name you Humpty? I mean, if their last name was already Dumpty, they could have named you John or Jim or Joe or something normal, but they had to go and name you Humpty. Well, actually, Humpty is just my nickname. Mrs. Roopy said, my real name is Lumpy. Lumpy Dumpty, I said. Yes, said Mrs. Roopy. So you can see why I'd rather be called Humpty. Andrea was getting all angry now. Mrs. Roopy was simply not going to admit she wasn't Humpty Dumpty. Nursery rhyme week is over, Mrs. Roopy, Andrea said. You can be yourself. You can stop pretending to be other people. Don't you like nursery rhymes? Asked Mrs. Roopy. Sure I do, Andrea said, but enough is enough. I hate nursery rhymes, I said. Nursery rhymes are dumb. I'm sick of nursery rhymes. Nursery rhymes are boring. Mrs. Roopy looked hurt. Everything's boring to you, AJ, she said sadly. I've tried so hard not to bore you. Please tell me, what is not boring to you? I put on my thinking cap. Well, not really. And tried real hard to think of something that wasn't boring. Trick bikes, I said. Trick bikes aren't boring. Chapter 12. The Proof. It was the middle of our afternoon snack time. I traded my pretzel sticks with Ryan for his cup of chocolate pudding. Suddenly, I heard somebody yelling down the hallway. Watch out, coming through, out of the way! I wonder what that could be, said Miss Daisy. The yelling got louder. Everybody in the class turned around just in time to see somebody ride into our classroom on a trick bike. It was Mrs. Roopy. She was wearing sunglasses, knee pads, elbow pads, and a floppy black t-shirt that said, "Bags for books." She had combed her hair to make it stick up all spiky. "Hey, dudes," she said as she skidded to a stop right in front of my desk. I just landed an awesomely tweaked towel whip with a Superman seat grabbed to a toothpick grind. You should have seen it. It was really sick. Everybody put down their snacks and gathered around my desk to look at Mrs. Roopy's cool bike. "I didn't know you knew so much about trick biking, Mrs. Roopy." "I'm not Mrs. Roopy," Mrs. Roopy said. "I'm a professional trick biker." "You are not," we all hollered. "You're Mrs. Roopy, the librarian." "Am not. It are too. It certainly looks like a trick biker to me," said Miss Daisy. That's when I came up with the most genius idea in the history of the world. Mrs. Roopy's tattoo. I remembered that she had a picture of a heart on her belly button. "You're Mrs. Roopy," I said, grabbing the bottom of her t-shirt, "and I can prove it." "Oh, stop that," Mrs. Roopy giggled. "I'm ticklish." When I yanked at her shirt, 3 books fell out. One of them hit my snack on my desk. The cup of chocolate pudding went flying. It splashed all over Mrs. Roopy's tummy. It almost covered up the tattoo of a heart, but we could still see it. "It's Mrs. Roopy!" Michael shouted. "The proof is in the pudding!" "Hey!" Ryan shouted. "Check out these books!" Ryan picked up the books that had dropped on the floor. They were books about trick biking. One of the books showed how to do tricks, and the other 2 were about famous trick bikers. Cool. "I didn't know they made books about trick biking," Ryan said. "So that's how you know so much about trick biking, Mrs. Roopy," I said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Roopy said. "I'm a professional trick biker." "Can I check these books out of the library?" asked Michael. "No, I get them first," Ryan said. "Hey, I was the one who found them," I said. Miss Daisy grabbed all the books. "Gee, I don't know, AJ," she said. "You said that reading was boring, so you probably wouldn't want to read these books." "Yes, I would," I shouted. "Please." "Well, okay," Miss Daisy said as she handed each of us one of the trick bike books. "But if you don't bring the keys back on time, Mrs. Roopy is going to lock you in the dungeon on the 3rd floor." We all looked at Mrs. Roopy. "Later, dudes," she said. And with that, Mrs. Roopy went paddling out into the hallway. I feel sorry for Mrs. Roopy. She is the loopiest librarian I've ever met. I think she's got a big problem. We're going to do all we can to help her, but it won't be easy. So that's the end of this book. I hope you enjoyed all my channels of it. And if you did, please click many likes and subscribe Reading Club. So I'll come back later with a new and improved channel. Bye everybody. See you later.